The moment you stopped chasing, everything changed. Not for you, for them. The silence you created became louder than every message, every effort, every attempt to prove your worth. And what happened next reveals a truth about human psychology that most people never understand. What if the very thing you thought would push someone away is the exact thing that makes them turn around? What if your absence awakens something your presence never could? Stay until the end, because what happens after you stop chasing is far more powerful than you imagine. Have you ever noticed that the harder you pursue something, the more it seems to slip away? Then suddenly, when you let go, the energy shifts. Calls come that never came before. Attention appears where there was indifference. Curiosity replaces certainty. If you have experienced this, comment, "I stopped chasing," below. I want to know how your life changed when you chose yourself instead of pursuing validation. If this message resonates with you so far, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs this reminder today. And tell me in the comments, what changed in your life when you finally stopped chasing? Now let's go deeper. Jung spoke often about the shadow, the hidden aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. Most people never realize how much of their emotional energy is spent chasing. They chase attention, approval, understanding, affection, and sometimes even basic respect. At first, it feels natural. The mind convinces itself that if it tries a little harder, explains a little better, or gives a little more, the desired response will eventually appear. Yet the unconscious mind often interprets constant pursuit differently. Instead of creating value, it can create familiarity. Instead of inspiring appreciation, it can encourage complacency. What is always available is often noticed the least. This is why many people become trapped in a cycle where the more they invest, the less they seem to receive in return. The moment a person stops chasing, a powerful psychological shift begins. The energy that was once flowing outward suddenly returns inward. Instead of focusing on another person's reactions, thoughts, or decisions, attention begins turning toward one's own life. This change may seem small on the surface, but it creates a profound transformation beneath awareness. The individual is no longer seeking validation from external sources. They are no longer measuring their worth by how quickly someone responds, how much attention they receive, or how strongly they are desired. This shift is often noticed by others because human beings become accustomed to patterns. When someone has always been available, always initiating contact, always making the effort, their behavior becomes predictable. Predictability creates a sense of certainty. The other person unconsciously assumes that the pursuit will continue indefinitely. When it suddenly stops, that certainty disappears. The absence creates a psychological gap that demands attention. Questions emerge where there were previously assumptions. Curiosity appears where there was once indifference. The silence becomes impossible to ignore because it highlights what was previously taken for granted. Carl Jung believed that much of human behavior is driven by unconscious forces. People frequently fail to recognize the true reasons behind their emotions and reactions. When pursuit ends, hidden feelings often rise to the surface. Someone who seemed unaffected may suddenly become curious, reflective, or even restless. Not necessarily because they have changed overnight, but because they are now confronting something they never had to face before. The withdrawal of attention acts like a mirror, exposing emotional dependencies, assumptions, and expectations that remained invisible while the pursuit continued. What once felt permanent now appears uncertain, and uncertainty has a remarkable ability to awaken awareness. One of the most misunderstood truths about human psychology is that people often do not recognize the value of something while it is constantly available to them. The mind adapts quickly to what is familiar. Attention that once felt special becomes expected. Effort that once seemed meaningful becomes routine. This process happens gradually and usually without conscious awareness. A person may genuinely appreciate your presence at first, but when your energy is always there, they stop noticing the significance of what you bring into their life. This is not always cruelty or selfishness. It is often a result of the unconscious tendency to normalize what is consistently accessible. When you stop chasing, This unconscious pattern is interrupted. The emotional environment changes. What was once predictable becomes uncertain. The certainty that your attention would always be available begins to disappear. Human beings are deeply sensitive to changes in emotional patterns, especially when those patterns have become part of their daily psychological landscape. Even if they never openly acknowledged your efforts, they felt the comfort of knowing you were there. Once that comfort is removed, awareness begins to awaken. Carl Jung understood that much of human behavior is influenced by what remains hidden beneath the surface. The unconscious mind stores expectations, assumptions, fears, and desires that often operate without our knowledge. When you stop pursuing someone, you remove a familiar source of emotional reassurance from their world. Suddenly, they are forced to confront feelings they may have ignored. They begin to notice the empty space where your attention once existed. They notice the conversations that no longer happen, the encouragement that no longer arrives, and the emotional energy that once surrounded them. This is why silence can sometimes be more powerful than explanation. Explanations often invite debate, resistance, or misunderstanding. Silence, however, creates space for reflection. Without constant communication, the other person is left alone with their own thoughts. The mind naturally seeks answers when a familiar pattern disappears. It begins asking questions that were never asked before. Why has the energy changed? Why does the absence feel noticeable? Why does the situation suddenly seem different? At the same time, something equally important happens within you. By stepping back from the pursuit, you begin reclaiming energy that was previously invested elsewhere. Your focus shifts toward personal growth, self-respect, and emotional independence. The need for external validation gradually weakens. Instead of trying to convince someone of your value, you begin recognizing that value for yourself. This inner transformation often creates a quiet confidence that others can sense. It is not created through manipulation or strategy. It emerges naturally when a person stops seeking approval and starts building a stronger relationship with their own identity and purpose. When pursuit stops, the most important change does not happen outside, but inside the emotional system of the person who was once chasing. For a long time, their behavior was guided by a single direction. Reach out, explain, fix, give more, try harder, and maintain connection at any cost. This creates a psychological loop where self-worth becomes tied to response. Every reply feels like relief, and every silence feels like rejection. Over time, this pattern trains the mind to believe that love, attention, or validation must be earned repeatedly through effort rather than received naturally. When that pattern suddenly breaks, the mind experiences an unfamiliar state. There is no longer a clear role to play, no message to send, no emotional negotiation to continue. At first, this can feel uncomfortable because the identity built around pursuit begins to lose its structure. The individual may feel a strange emptiness, not because something external is missing, but because a habitual emotional cycle has ended. This is where transformation quietly begins, although it is rarely recognized in the moment. Carl Jung would describe this as a confrontation with the self. When external focus collapses, internal awareness rises. The energy that was once directed outward starts returning inward, forcing reflection. Thoughts that were previously ignored begin to surface. Questions appear that were not allowed space before. Why was I trying so hard? Why did I feel unseen? Why did I believe effort alone would change the outcome? These questions are not just emotional, they are psychological signals of awakening consciousness. At the same time, the absence of pursuit creates a new external dynamic. The other person, who was used to consistent attention, begins to experience disruption in expectation. Even if they did not consciously value the constant effort, their mind registered it as stability. Humans often underestimate how deeply they rely on predictable emotional patterns. When those patterns change, curiosity is triggered. Not always immediately, and not always in a dramatic way, but in subtle psychological waves such as noticing silence more than presence or thinking about the shift in energy without fully understanding why. However, the deeper significance of this moment is not about their reaction. It is about the internal reorganization that happens within the one who stopped chasing. Emotional dependence begins to weaken. Self-observation becomes stronger. The need for constant external reassurance loses intensity. Slowly, identity shifts from being someone who seeks validation to someone who observes, reflects, and rebuilds inner stability. This transition is not instant or linear, but it marks the beginning of emotional independence, where behavior is no longer controlled by the fear of losing someone's attention, but guided by awareness of personal worth and direction. When a person withdraws their pursuit, the emotional system that once revolved around another person begins to reorganize itself in a deeper way than most people expect. For a long time, their attention, thoughts, and even daily mood may have been shaped by whether there was a response, a message, or a sign of connection. This creates an internal dependency loop where external validation becomes a quiet source of emotional regulation. The mind starts to equate presence with safety and silence with loss. Over time, this pattern becomes so familiar that it feels normal, even though it slowly weakens inner stability. The moment this pursuit stops, the mind does not immediately understand what has changed. There is often a brief period of emotional confusion because the system that used to operate automatically has been interrupted. Thoughts that were once focused outward suddenly have no direction. This creates a space where discomfort, reflection, and awareness begin to emerge. The individual may feel a sense of emptiness, not because something external is actively missing, but because the emotional habit of reaching outward has lost its outlet. From a Jungian perspective, this moment represents a shift from unconscious behavior to conscious awareness. Carl Jung emphasized that much of human experience is governed by patterns we do not fully see. When pursuit ends, those patterns are disrupted, and the unconscious mind is forced into visibility. The individual begins to notice not only what they were doing, but why they were doing it. Questions arise that were previously buried beneath emotional urgency. Why did I feel the need to keep trying? Why did I believe effort alone could secure emotional certainty? Why did silence feel so unbearable? At the same time, the external dynamic also begins to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. The absence of constant attention creates a break in expectation. Even if the other person never consciously acknowledged the pursuit, their mind had adapted to it. Humans naturally form expectations around consistency. When something consistent disappears, the mind reacts with attention, even if that attention is not immediately expressed as action. The absence becomes noticeable because it disrupts emotional predictability. However, the most important transformation is not occurring in their perception, but in the inner restructuring of the one who stopped chasing. Energy that was once scattered across worry, anticipation, and emotional interpretation begins to return inward. Self-awareness strengthens as external dependency weakens. The individual starts to observe their own patterns instead of being controlled by them. This creates a quiet but powerful shift from emotional reactivity to inner stability, where worth is no longer determined by response or recognition, but begins to exist independently within the self. When pursuit comes to an end, something subtle but profound begins to unfold in both psychological and emotional layers of the human mind. For a long time, the individual may have been operating under the assumption that connection must be maintained through continuous effort, explanation, or emotional investment. This creates a pattern where attention becomes something that must be secured repeatedly, rather than something that exists naturally. In such a state, emotional energy is constantly directed outward, scanning for signs of response, approval, or reassurance. Over time, this outward orientation can make a person feel emotionally dependent without fully realizing it. When that pursuit suddenly stops, the mind initially struggles to adjust. The habitual cycle of action and response is broken. There is no longer a role to perform, no emotional strategy to maintain, and no immediate direction for attention. This creates a temporary internal silence that can feel unfamiliar. In that silence, thoughts begin to surface that were previously overshadowed by constant emotional activity. The individual may begin to question not only the situation, but also their own patterns of behavior. Why did I feel the need to try so hard? Why did I equate effort with emotional security? Why did I ignore my own emotional state while focusing so heavily on the response of another person? Carl Jung's psychological perspective helps explain this transition as a movement from unconscious compulsion to conscious awareness. The unconscious mind often drives repetitive emotional behaviors without being directly observed. When pursuit ends, these unconscious patterns are interrupted, allowing them to become visible. This visibility is uncomfortable at first because it forces the individual to confront parts of themselves that were previously hidden beneath emotional urgency. What once felt like devotion may now be seen as dependency, and what once felt like connection may now be recognized as imbalance. At the same time, a shift begins in external perception as well. When someone is consistently pursued, they unconsciously adapt to that presence. It becomes part of their emotional environment, even if they do not actively acknowledge it. The sudden absence of that presence disrupts this familiarity. The mind naturally reacts to changes in emotional patterns, even when those patterns were not consciously valued. The absence creates a gap in expectation, and that gap draws attention simply because it breaks routine. However, the deeper transformation occurs within the person who has stopped chasing. As outward focus diminishes, inner awareness begins to grow. Emotional energy that was once spent on interpretation, anticipation, and reaction starts returning to the self. This return creates space for reflection, self-understanding, and emotional independence. Gradually, the individual begins to detach their sense of worth from external response, moving toward a more stable internal foundation, where identity is no longer defined by pursuit or validation, but by self-awareness and inner clarity. When a person stops chasing, the change that follows is rarely understood in real time because it does not begin with external drama, but with internal reorganization. For a long period, emotional energy may have been directed toward maintaining connection, interpreting responses, and adjusting behavior based on how the other person reacts. This creates a psychological dependency loop where attention becomes a form of emotional regulation. The mind learns to associate effort with hope and response with relief, which slowly shifts the sense of balance inward and outward in an unstable way. Once this pursuit stops, the first noticeable shift is internal confusion. The mind is used to constant engagement, even if that engagement was emotionally draining. When that pattern disappears, there is a sudden absence of direction. Thoughts that were previously occupied with external focus begin to turn inward, but without clarity at first. This can feel like emotional silence, yet beneath that silence there is a deep restructuring taking place. The brain begins to recalibrate its priorities because the constant cycle of anticipation and reaction is no longer active. From a Jungian perspective, this moment represents the withdrawal of projection. Carl Jung explained that people often place unconscious expectations onto others, believing they will fulfill emotional needs that are actually internal. When pursuit ends, those projections lose their anchor. What remains is a more direct confrontation with the self. The individual starts to see their own patterns more clearly, including tendencies toward overgiving, overthinking, or seeking validation in external approval. These realizations do not always arrive as sudden insights, but rather as gradual awareness that builds over time. On the outside, the absence of pursuit can create subtle shifts in perception. Humans are deeply adaptive to emotional patterns. When someone consistently shows attention, it becomes part of the expected environment, even if it is not consciously appreciated. When that attention disappears, the mind notices the disruption. It may not immediately translate into action or expression, but it creates a subtle cognitive gap where curiosity and reflection begin to form. The silence stands out precisely because it breaks familiarity. However, the most significant transformation is occurring within the individual who has stepped back. As emotional energy is no longer consumed by external monitoring, it begins returning inward. This shift allows for the rebuilding of identity independent of external response. Over time, the person begins to detach their sense of worth from outcomes and reactions. Instead of existing in a state of emotional pursuit, they gradually enter a state of awareness where self-understanding replaces dependency. This marks the beginning of emotional autonomy, where actions are no longer driven by fear of loss or desire for validation, but guided by inner stability and clarity. When pursuit finally ends, the most important shift is not immediately visible because it happens beneath conscious awareness. For a long time, emotional energy may have been directed outward in the form of effort, attention, explanation, and anticipation. The mind becomes conditioned to believe that maintaining connection requires continuous input and that silence or withdrawal would lead to loss. This creates a psychological loop where self-worth becomes entangled with external response and emotional stability depends on how consistently attention is returned. Once this loop is broken, the mind enters a state of recalibration. At first, this feels like disorientation because the habitual pattern of seeking and receiving feedback is no longer active. Thoughts that were once focused outward no longer have a clear target, so they begin turning inward. This inward shift does not immediately bring clarity. Instead, it often reveals emotional noise that was previously hidden by constant engagement. The absence of external activity exposes internal questions that were never fully addressed. From a Jungian viewpoint, this stage reflects the withdrawal of unconscious projections. Carl Jung suggested that people often project their unmet emotional needs onto others, expecting them to fulfill roles that actually belong within the self. When pursuit stops, these projections lose their outlet. What remains is a direct confrontation with inner emotional patterns. The individual begins to recognize tendencies such as over-attachment, fear of abandonment, or reliance on external validation for emotional stability. These realizations may not arrive as sudden insights but emerge gradually through reflection and emotional distance. At the same time, the external dynamic shifts in subtle ways. Human beings are highly sensitive to consistency, even when they do not consciously acknowledge it. When someone has been consistently present, offering attention and emotional energy, it becomes part of the expected environment. The sudden absence of that presence creates a disruption in psychological familiarity. The mind naturally reacts to this disruption by registering curiosity or awareness, not always as immediate action, but as internal recognition that something has changed. However, the deeper transformation occurs within the individual who has stepped away from chasing. As external focus diminishes, emotional energy begins to return inward, creating space for self-observation and internal alignment. The individual starts to see themselves more clearly without the distortion of constant external validation. Over time, this leads to a shift in identity, where self-worth is no longer dependent on response or approval. Instead, awareness becomes centered within the self, allowing emotional independence to develop gradually as attention moves from seeking to understanding, from reacting to observing, and from dependency to inner stability.